The river ran slow that night beneath a copper moon, the sound of water lapping against stone the only thing left that still spoke to Jesse Rowan. He had been alone for months on that patch of land, long enough to forget how human voices fit between the wind and the crickets. His cabin sat 20 yards from the bank, built from cedar he cut himself and patched with memory. There was a saddle by the door, a Bible under dust, and a chair that had never faced another. The fire burned low, throwing light across his hands, scarred, steady, still waiting for a purpose. When the first knock came, it was so soft he thought it was the wind. The second came harder. Jesse froze. No one rode this far north unless they were running from something. He reached for his rifle but didn't lift it, not yet. "Who's there?" he called, voice rough from disuse. No answer. Only breathing. He opened the door a crack, and moonlight fell over a figure half collapsed against the frame. A young woman, drenched from the river mist, barefoot, her dress torn at the hem. Her lips trembled, but she didn't flinch at the sight of the gun. "Please," she whispered. "Just a minute of warmth." He stared, torn between caution and instinct. The eyes looking up at him weren't begging, they were braced, as if she expected refusal. He lowered the rifle. "Get in." She stepped inside, shaking from cold and fear, the scent of rain and river clinging to her. He threw his coat around her shoulders and set her by the fire, saying nothing. For a long time, neither spoke. The only sound was the pop of pine in the flames. When her shivering eased, she whispered her name. Mara Lee. Her voice cracked like a branch under frost. She said she'd walked 2 nights from a farm beyond Stillwater, from a house where she was meant to be married by force to a man older than her father. Jesse poured her coffee, black and bitter, and watched her hands wrap around the cup as if it were hope itself. "You alone out here?" she asked. He nodded. "By choice." "Then I'm safe for tonight." He didn't answer. The river hissed against the shore outside, a slow pulse like a warning. "They'll be looking," she said after a while, eyes fixed on the fire. "They always do when something escapes what they think they own." Jesse studied her face, mud on her cheek, a cut on her lip, courage hiding behind exhaustion. He wanted to ask who they were, but didn't. The question already lived in her eyes. He stood, took a wool blanket from the cot, and handed it to her. "You can rest there," he said. "I'll keep the fire." She hesitated. "You don't even know me." "Don't need to," he replied. "Cold's enough enemy for one night." She lay down near the hearth, pulling the blanket up to her chin, still watching him like someone who'd never been granted trust but was trying to learn it. Outside, thunder rolled over the mountains, though no storm followed. Jesse sat by the window, watching the tree line. Somewhere in the dark, a horse whinnied, faint and distant. He reached for his rifle and checked the latch on the door. Mara's eyes were closed now, lashes wet, breath steady. He whispered to himself, almost a prayer he hadn't used in years. Not again. The knock had broken more than silence. It had woken the part of him that still believed people could be saved. And as the night deepened and hoofbeats faded into the river's murmur, Jesse Rowan realized he wasn't the only soul being hunted by what he'd left behind. Dawn came gray and trembling, a thin sheet of light crawling over the river like something afraid to wake what the night had hidden. Jesse had been sitting by the window for hours, rifle across his knees. The fire burned low to embers. He hadn't slept. Not once. When the first bird cried out across the valley, he saw movement through the fog, a flicker of brown coats at the tree line, too still to be hunters, too quiet to be travelers. He cursed under his breath and stood. "Up," he said sharply. Mara stirred on the floorboards, blinking into wakefulness. "What is it?" Riders, he said. 3 of them, moving slow like they already know where they're going. She went pale. He sent men. Jesse didn't ask who. He grabbed his hat and coat, kicked dirt over the fire, and handed her a small knife from his belt. You ride behind me. If they catch up, you drop off and keep north along the river till you see Cedar Cliffs. Don't stop. And you? She asked. I'll draw their eyes where I can. She shook her head, terrified but stubborn. I can ride. Not faster than fear, he said, already leading her outside. The morning mist hugged the ground thick as smoke. His horse, Dust, snorted and pawed the dirt. Mara climbed up behind him, clutching the saddle horn as Jesse spurred forward. They slipped into the trees, hooves muffled by the damp earth, branches clawing at their shoulders. Behind them, shouts cracked through the quiet. The chase had begun. The trail narrowed, forcing Jesse to lean low over the horse's mane, guiding it between the trunks. How far will they follow? He shouted. All the way, she yelled back. He doesn't let things go. A gunshot tore through the trees, splintering bark above her head. She gasped, ducking lower, gripping him tighter. Jesse turned the horse hard left into thicker woods, letting branches whip across his arms. Another shot, closer this time. He could hear their horses, 2, maybe 3, riding in a wide arc to box him in. He glanced at Mara. Her face was pale, her breath shallow, but her grip didn't falter. You trust me? He asked. I wouldn't be here if I didn't. He urged Dust toward a ridge overlooking the river and dismounted, pulling her down beside him. Go down that way, he said, pointing toward a ravine hidden by brush. Follow the stream. It'll bend west and hide your tracks. And you? I'll make sure they don't follow you first. She hesitated only a moment before nodding. The way she looked at him then, like someone who already knew loss but chose to hope anyway, struck something deep he thought had died long ago. She disappeared through the brush as Jesse climbed higher, rifle ready. The riders broke through minutes later, calling her name, mocking, confident. He waited until the first one raised his head, then fired once into the air. The echo boomed across the valley, scattering crows into the light. You want her? He shouted. You'll have to ride through me first. They turned their horses toward the sound. Below, the river kept whispering, carrying her name somewhere far from where he stood, ready to bleed for it. The echo of the gunshot rolled through the valley until it sounded like thunder trapped in the pines. Jesse waited, crouched behind a fallen log, eyes fixed on the glint of metal through the fog. One rider broke ahead of the others, shouting something he couldn't make out. The second followed, younger, reckless. Jesse held his breath, let them come close, then fired again, this time lower. The first man's hat flew off. His horse screamed and veered. Chaos followed. Dust rose, curses rang, and before the third rider could draw, Jesse moved. He slid down the ridge, boots cutting into mud, firing one more round that shattered the rock inches from their stirrups. The message was clear. The pursuers broke formation and turned, riding hard the other way. When the forest swallowed their sound, Jesse exhaled and dropped to his knees. He didn't feel brave. He just felt tired. The wind carried the smell of gunpowder and pine sap, familiar scents from a life he'd buried years back. He slung the rifle over his shoulder and made his way down the slope toward the ravine where Mara had gone. The fog was lifting now, sunlight slicing through in gold ribbons that turned the dew into glass. He followed the stream, its water cold and fast, until he saw the hem of her dress caught on a bush. Mara, he called softly. No answer. He pushed through the brush and found her sitting by the water, knees pulled to her chest, her hair loose, her face streaked with tears and mud. She wasn't hiding, just waiting. She looked up at him, eyes wide with something between fear and relief. For a long moment, neither spoke. The silence wasn't heavy. It was fragile, alive. He dropped to one knee beside her, uncorked his canteen, and set it near her feet. She took it, drinking slow, then offered it back. Their fingers brushed, once lightly, and both froze. Jessie looked away first, staring at the current. "They gone?" she asked quietly. "For now." "You hurt?" "Not yet." She smiled faintly, a small curve that didn't reach her eyes. The sound of water filled the space where words could have been. He tore a strip from his sleeve and handed it to her. "Your hand," he said. "You're bleeding." She hesitated but let him wrap it. His touch was rough but careful, and she watched his face the whole time. When he tied the knot, she whispered, "You didn't have to." He nodded once. "I know." Then came stillness, the kind that speaks more than any vow. The river moved past them, carrying bits of light like memory. Her head tilted, hair brushing her cheek, and he saw it then. She wasn't fragile. She was surviving. And somehow, that hurt more than all the things he'd lost. When she finally rose, he followed without a word. They climbed back toward the trail, sunlight growing stronger with every step. Behind them, the river kept its secrets. Ahead, somewhere unseen, trouble was already learning their names. By the time they reached the old trading post, the clouds had gathered thick and low, pressing down on the valley like a hand trying to smother light. The place looked abandoned from the trail. One leaning sign, a porch half collapsed, and a single lantern flickering behind dusty glass. Jessie tied the horse under the awning and motioned for Mara to stay behind him. "We just get food," he murmured. "In and out." She nodded, pulling his coat tighter around her shoulders. Inside, the air smelled of tobacco, rain, and old wood. A bearded clerk looked up from behind the counter, eyes narrowing when he saw them. "Ain't seen you here before," he said. Jessie dropped a few coins on the counter. "Flour, coffee, dried meat." "Storm's comin'," the man muttered, counting the coins slowly. "Don't want to be out past dark. Not with them riders prowlin' for a runaway bride." Mara froze behind Jessie, her breath catching. Jessie didn't turn, didn't blink. "Don't know nothing about that," he said. "Just need supplies." The clerk shrugged and filled a small sack, but his eyes flicked toward the window, where a poster flapped against the glass, rain streaking the paper. Jessie glanced at it. "Wanted. Runaway from Stillwater Ranch. Reward. $50 unharmed." The sketch was crude, but the eyes were right. Mara's eyes. He took the bag, gave a tight nod, and started for the door. "She looks familiar," the clerk said behind them. "Pretty little thing like that, can't forget." Jessie stopped just long enough to say, "Forget faster," and opened the door. The rain had started. Sheets of it, cold and relentless. They ran for the horse, the world already dissolving into gray. As they mounted, the door slammed open behind them. "You bring her back, you'll get paid double," the clerk yelled through the downpour. Jessie didn't answer. He spurred dust forward, the horse's hooves splashing through mud, wind whipping their faces. The storm swallowed everything, the road, the forest, even their own breathing. Mara clung to him, her fingers digging into his coat. Lightning cracked across the ridge, showing her face for a heartbeat, terrified but alive. "He'll tell them," she said. "They'll come again." "Then we keep moving," Jessie said, shouting over the thunder, "till they can't find which way we went." "There's no place left," she cried. "Everywhere's his." Jesse pulled the reins, turning the horse toward the dark line of hills. "Then we make a place." The rain came harder, blinding, drumming against their skin until it felt like punishment. When they finally reached the shelter of a canyon wall, they slid off the horse and collapsed under an outcrop of rock, breathless and soaked. Jesse watched her shake, lips blue, and felt a knot tighten in his chest. He built a small fire with trembling hands, struck flint until the spark caught, and light spilled across her face. For a moment neither spoke. Then she whispered, "You could have left me." "I've done enough leaving," he said quietly. She stared into the flames, the storm still raging beyond them, and said the words that would follow them for miles. "Then you'll have to learn how to stay." The storm lasted through the night and well into the next day, the kind that turned the sky to iron and the air to steam. By dusk, Mara could barely stand. Her lips were cracked, her eyes unfocused, her breath shallow. Jesse laid her near the hearth, stripped off her soaked dress, and wrapped her in his only dry blanket, turning his back as he worked. Her skin burned under his hand, fever already rising fast. "Stay awake," he said. She tried, her voice weak. "I'm fine." "No, you're not." He crushed dried herbs into a pot of boiling water, the smell of sage and smoke mixing with rain seeping through the roof. He spooned the bitter brew to her lips, steady but gentle. She coughed, swallowed, then drifted again. Her words came half delirious. "He said I'd never make it, that I'd die in the cold. Guess he gets to be right." Jesse leaned close, his voice low and steady. "He doesn't get to be right about anything." Her eyes opened faintly. "Why are you helping me?" He didn't answer. He dipped a rag into the pot, squeezed it out, and pressed it to her forehead. Her skin hissed under the heat. He wiped her temples, her hands, every motion careful as prayer. The firelight painted her face in gold and shadow, and for the first time since she arrived, she didn't look hunted. She looked human. Someone who deserved more than what the world had given. He sat beside her through the long hours, listening to the storm breathe against the walls, the rain easing by midnight. Once, her hand slipped from the blanket, fingers grazing his wrist. He froze, then let her rest there. No words followed. Just warmth shared between two souls who had forgotten it could still exist. By morning, the fever broke, sweat cooling on her skin. The air outside was still and washed clean. Jesse opened the door to let in light, the smell of wet pine drifting through. When he turned back, Mara was awake, her hair plastered to her face, eyes clearer than before. "You stayed," she whispered. He smiled faintly, the kind that barely reached his mouth. "Didn't have anywhere better to be." She tried to laugh, but winced instead. "You don't talk much." "Don't need to. Fire does enough of it." She studied him, her gaze slow, deliberate, searching. "You were married once," she said softly. He stiffened. "How would you know?" "You talk to silence like it answers you." The words hit deep, clean and sharp. He didn't reply, only poured water into a tin cup and held it out. "Drink." She did, eyes still on him. When she finished, she leaned back, exhaustion catching her again. He watched her drift off, then turned to the fire. He'd tended wounds before, his, others, but this was different. This wasn't survival. It was something else trying to be born inside the wreck of a man who thought he'd buried all that long ago. Outside, sunlight finally broke through the clouds, turning the river silver again. For the first time in years, Jesse let himself believe that morning could mean more than just another day to outlast. The rain was gone by morning, leaving behind air so clear it felt like the world had been scrubbed raw. The cabin smelled of smoke, pine, and the faint sweetness of boiled coffee. Mara slept late, her breathing even for the first time since she'd come knocking. Jesse sat by the window sharpening his knife, not because it needed it, but because his hands didn't know how to be still anymore. When she stirred, he looked over, unsure whether to speak or let the silence do what it had been doing just fine. She sat up slowly, blinking against the light. "It's quiet," she said, voice hoarse but calm. "First time I've heard quiet without being scared of it." He nodded. "Quiet's honest. It tells you who you are when no one's looking." She smiled faintly. "And who are you, Jesse Rowan?" He didn't answer, just turned the knife once in his hand and set it aside. "Hungry?" She nodded, and he ladled stew into a tin bowl, the kind of meal made from what's left, not what's planned. She ate slow, each spoonful careful, like she was afraid the moment might break if she moved too fast. When she finished, she wiped her mouth with her sleeve and whispered, "Thank you." He said nothing, but his eyes softened, just enough for her to notice. A beam of sunlight cut through the window, falling across the floorboards and her bare feet, making them look almost golden against the rough wood. She noticed him watching, and for a heartbeat, neither moved. Then, as if time itself paused to listen, she reached out and touched the scar running along his forearm. Her hand was light, trembling, but he didn't pull away. The air changed. No rush, no words. Just the kind of stillness that has its own language. She traced the mark once, her thumb brushing the edge. "What happened?" she asked softly. "River took more than I gave it," he said. "My wife went in after the horse. I went after her. Only one of us came out." She withdrew her hand, guilt shadowing her face. "I'm sorry." "Don't be," he said. "Wasn't your storm." She studied him for a long time before saying, "You don't have to carry her ghost by yourself." He looked at her then, and for a moment he wasn't sure which ghost she meant, his wife's or his own. He stood, pacing once, then stopped near the door. "You should rest again. We move at sundown." "Move where? Someplace dry? Someplace folks don't ask questions?" "That a real place?" she asked, smiling a little. "Not yet," he said. She watched him for a long moment, then lay back down, eyes still open, watching the fire. When he turned, she was asleep again. The knife lay forgotten beside the chair, and Jesse realized his hands had stopped shaking. Outside, the river ran smooth and slow, carrying the first light of afternoon across its back like a promise no one dared speak aloud. For a few blessed minutes, the world seemed to breathe without needing anything from them at all. They left the cabin before dusk, following the trail west through thick reeds and silver birch where the ground turned soft beneath the horses' hooves. The sky was bruised with clouds again, not from rain, but from the wind that swept through the valley with restless intent. Jesse rode ahead, scanning the distance, every instinct sharp. Mara followed close, quiet but uneasy. She'd wrapped his coat tight around her shoulders, her hair braided low like a girl trying to disappear. The forest thinned as they neared the old wagon road that led to the edge of town. "You sure about this?" she asked finally. "Town's the last place they'd expect us to go," he said. "Or the first," she muttered. "That's the trick," he replied, almost smiling. They reached the river crossing by nightfall. The moon hung low, turning the water black. Jesse dismounted, knelt by the mud, and found the shape of a horseshoe pressed deep and fresh. He didn't speak, but his shoulders tensed. "They're close," she asked. "Close enough." He stood, dusted his hands, and motioned for silence. In the distance, the faint jingle of tack, the soft thud of hooves. 3 riders again. They had followed the current, using the river to mask their trail. Jesse grabbed Mara's arm and pulled her down behind a fallen tree. "Stay low," he whispered. The riders passed slow, their lanterns cutting narrow cones of light through the mist. One of them called out, "Rowan, you ain't the only one who knows how to hide?" The voice was cruel and too certain. Mara clutched his sleeve, her breathing shallow. Jesse waited until their voices faded down the bend before he rose. "We'll head to town," he said. "If they're following the river, they'll swing wide." "You think we can just walk in?" "Walk quiet enough." By dawn, the outlines of Redemption Hollow rose through the fog, 10 buildings and a steeple, still asleep. Jesse led the horse behind the livery stable, tied it in shadow, and motioned toward the back street. "We get supplies, then keep north," he said. But before they could move, the sound of boots struck the plank road. 2 deputies stepped into view, rifles across their chests, badges catching the weak sun. One squinted at Jesse, then at Mara. "You Rowan?" "Used to be," Jesse said. "Not anymore." The man nodded slowly. "We got word about a runaway girl, and a man matching your face. Sheriff wants a word." Mara stiffened. "Don't," she whispered. "They'll take you instead of me." Jesse turned to her, his expression unreadable. "Then it'll be the last thing I let them take." He stepped forward, hands raised, voice calm. "Tell your sheriff I ain't running." The deputies exchanged a glance, confused but ready. One gestured toward the jailhouse down the street. "You can tell him yourself." Jesse looked back at Mara once more. The same way a man looks at a sunrise he knows he won't see twice. And then followed them into the waking town, mud clinging to his boots like something that didn't want to let go. The town of Redemption Hollow gathered slow that morning, drawn by the rumor that the river ghost had been caught, a man who hid women and defied lawmen. By the time the clock struck noon, the street was lined with faces, some curious, some hungry for another story to whisper over supper. The sheriff stood in front of the jailhouse steps, hat low, voice rough from years of dust and whiskey. Jesse stood between 2 deputies, wrists bound but head high. The sunlight fell straight on him, no shadows left to hide behind. "Jesse Rowan," the sheriff called. "You're charged with aiding the abduction of Mara Lee, runaway bride of Stillwater Ranch. What do you say for yourself?" Jesse looked past him, eyes finding Mara in the crowd. She stood near the church fence, pale and small beneath his coat, her hands clenched around its sleeves. He didn't speak. The sheriff frowned. "Cat got your tongue, or guilt?" "Neither," Jesse said finally. "Just tired of wrong men doing the talking." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. The sheriff motioned toward the gallows, still wet from the rain. "Law says you hang if the lady doesn't speak up." Jesse smiled faintly. "Then I guess law don't know her yet." The sheriff turned to Mara. "You'll step forward now. Say he forced you or stand aside." The street went still. A gust of wind lifted dust into the air like ghosts waiting to listen. Mara's voice came quiet but clear. "He saved me." "That ain't what we heard," someone shouted. She raised her chin. "Then you heard from men who never listened before." She stepped closer to the platform, her feet sinking into mud. But she didn't stop. "He found me half dead by the river, fed me, healed me, and never once asked for anything but silence." The sheriff looked uneasy. "Girl, you understand the weight of what you're saying? You're defending a criminal." "No," she said. "I'm defending the only man in this town who remembers what mercy looks like." The crowd shifted. First whispers, then guilt creeping into the faces that had come to watch another hanging. Jessie met her eyes, and in that single look, there was everything they hadn't said since the night she knocked. "You should let him go," she said to the sheriff, voice trembling but sure. "You can keep your law, but don't call it justice anymore." The sheriff hesitated. He glanced at the deputies, at the townsfolk, at the empty rope that swung faintly in the wind. Then, with a sigh that carried the weight of every wrong he'd ever looked away from, he nodded. "Cut him loose." The deputy slashed the bindings. Jessie rubbed his wrists, the skin raw but his eyes steady. He looked at Mara, then at the crowd. "You all think hanging a man makes you clean," he said. "It don't. Only doing right does." The sheriff swallowed hard. "You done?" Jessie nodded once. "No, just getting started." The church bell rang then, off cue as if even heaven had been holding its breath. In that sound, something shifted. Law had lost, but justice had finally come to town. The sun slipped lower, turning the street to gold dust and long shadows, the kind that made sinners and saints look the same for a little while. Jessie stood in front of the church, wrists red but free, the sound of the dispersing crowd a low hum behind him. No one cheered. They just looked, at him, at Mara, at themselves, each one seeing something they'd rather forget. The sheriff lingered near the steps, hat in hand, face worn thin. "You made a fool out of me today, Rowan," he said. Jessie glanced toward the gallows, still standing in the square. "World's full of bigger fools than you, Sheriff. You just stopped being one." The older man sighed, rubbed his neck. "You gonna run?" Jessie shook his head. "I've been running since the river took my wife. I think I'll stop now." The sheriff's gaze softened, like maybe he understood. "Then do one thing for me," he said, nodding towards the open church door. Inside, the preacher waited behind the pulpit, Bible already open, unsure which way grace would fall. Jessie stepped in, the wood creaking under his boots. The air smelled of candle wax and dust, sunlight slanting through the cracked glass windows in lines of gold. Mara followed him, slow but steady. The preacher cleared his throat. "The law can't write forgiveness, son," he said, "but the good book can bear witness if you mean to start new." Jessie placed his hand on the Bible. "Ain't much I can swear to anymore," he murmured, "but I'll try not to be the man I was." The preacher nodded once. "That's all heaven ever asks." Mara moved closer, setting her hand on top of his. The moment stretched long, soft as breath. "Then you ain't alone in it," she said. He looked at her, really looked, the way you do when something stops being temporary. She wasn't the frightened girl from the river anymore. She stood taller now, steadier, eyes no longer pleading but daring the world to try again. "You could stay," the preacher said gently. "Help mend what you broke." Jessie gave a small smile. "Not sure they want me fixing their town. Maybe they need you more than they want you." Outside, the bell rang once, echoing through the valley like a heartbeat returning to a body that had been too long dead. Jessie let go of the Bible and turned to Mara. "You sure about staying?" She met his gaze without flinching. "I was never sure of anything before you opened that door." They stepped back into the sunlight, the crowd already thinning, some tipping their hats, others pretending not to stare. The sheriff called after him, "What now, Rowan?" Jessie looked at Mara, then at the horizon glowing faintly beyond the river. "Now we build something that doesn't need ropes or judges to stand." He took Mara's hand, not for show, not for gratitude, just for truth, and together they walked down the steps. Behind them, the preacher closed the Bible, whispering a verse that no one heard but the wind. "Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy." The next morning rose slow and tender, the kind of dawn that felt like the land itself wanted to forget yesterday. Mist drifted off the river in ribbons, and the air smelled of wet sage and baking bread from the town below. Jesse stood on the porch of his cabin again, only now the boards had been swept, the door unbarred, and the smoke from the hearth rose steady instead of angry. Mara was inside humming softly, sleeves rolled up as she washed the tin plates in a basin of clean water. Her hair was loose again, sun turning it to gold where it caught the window light. For a while he just watched her through the open door, the quiet filling him more than words ever could. When she noticed him, she smiled. An easy, ordinary smile that made the world feel possible. "Fire's ready," she said. "You should eat before you start work." "Work?" he asked, half smiling. "You said you wanted to build something that stands." She handed him a cup of coffee, still steaming. "We'll need a fence first, and a roof that doesn't leak every time it remembers to rain." He took the cup, the warmth seeping into his palms. "You sound like you plan on staying a while." "Maybe," she said softly. "Depends who else does." He looked past her to the river, its surface calm and bright. The same river that once drowned everything he loved now carried sunlight like a promise kept. "I used to think peace was for people who'd done everything right," he said quietly. "Now I figure it's for folks who finally stop running." "Then you found the right place," she said, "and the right company." They ate in silence, the kind that didn't need fixing. After breakfast, Jesse stepped outside, hammer in hand, surveying the broken fence line. Mara followed, carrying nails in a small tin. They worked side by side, the rhythm of hammer strikes and wind blending like music. Each post they set, straight, felt like a prayer answered without needing to be spoken. At midday, the sheriff rode up the trail, hat low, horse slow. He stopped at the fence and nodded. "Didn't figure I'd see you still here," he said. "Didn't figure you'd let me be," Jesse replied. The sheriff smiled faintly. "Town's got new laws now, ones that start with listening." He reached into his coat and pulled out Jesse's old badge, now polished, the metal catching the sun. "Thought you might want this back." Jesse stared at it, then shook his head. "Better hang it in the church. Let it remind folks what almost happened." The sheriff nodded once, tipped his hat to Mara, and rode off without another word. Jesse watched him go, then turned back to the river. Mara stood beside him, hands dusty from work, face bright with quiet pride. "You think they'll ever forget?" she asked. "Not if we keep living better than they remember?" The wind shifted then, lifting her hair, carrying laughter across the yard. Hers first, then his, blending with the sound of water running free. Somewhere in that breeze, the land itself seemed to breathe again, unafraid of its own echoes. For the first time in years, Jesse Rowan didn't hear ghosts when the river moved, only life continuing exactly as it should. Please like, share, and subscribe to support more true-hearted stories on Stories Left Behind. If you had stood by the river that night, would you have opened the door or walked away from the sound of mercy? Tell us in the comments.